January 17, 1945. Somewhere over the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, the American C-47 transport aircraft banked low through morning fog, its engines grinding against the frozen wind. Inside the fuselage, 3 German generals sat in silence, their field-gray uniforms still dusted with the ash of shattered command posts. General Major Karl Decker stared through the small window at the landscape below. Villages reduced to skeletal frames, roads carved into the earth by tank treads, and the black smoke of distant fires still drifting across the horizon. His throat was dry, coated with the residue of 3 days without proper water, and his stomach twisted from hunger that had gnawed at him since the collapse of the Bulge offensive. He had expected interrogation. He had expected cruelty. He had expected the kind of retribution that his own army had perfected in the East. What he did not expect was the smell of fresh coffee wafting from the cockpit, or the American officer seated across from him unwrapping a chocolate bar with casual indifference, as if the war were already a settled matter of paperwork. The generals had been captured in the chaos of the German retreat, their once proud divisions shattered by American artillery and the relentless advance of Patton's Third Army. Decker had commanded a panzer division. Beside him sat General Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann, who had overseen infantry operations in the Eifel region, and Oberst Wilhelm Krauss, an artillery commander whose guns had fallen silent when fuel and ammunition ran dry. They were men trained in Prussian discipline, men who had risen through the Wehrmacht under the promise of German superiority, of Lebensraum, of a 1,000-year Reich. Now they were prisoners, ferried like cargo toward an uncertain fate, their iron crosses and medals a meaningless weight against their chests. When the plane touched down at a makeshift airfield near Reims, they were led down the ramp into the cold morning light. American soldiers stood in loose formation, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, their faces unshaven but not unkind. There was no shouting, no brutality. A young captain with a clipboard approached and spoke in accented but competent German. "Gentlemen, you will be escorted to the interrogation center. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention." Decker nodded stiffly, his mouth too parched to reply. He wanted to ask for water. His pride held him back. They were loaded into a truck with benches along the sides, the canvas flaps rolled down against the cold. As the vehicle rumbled through the French countryside, past columns of American trucks hauling supplies forward, Decker caught glimpses of the logistical machinery that had crushed his forces. He had read intelligence reports, of course, but seeing it was different. The roads were clogged with vehicles, not just tanks and half-tracks, but trucks carrying crates stamped with English words he did not understand. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies. The sheer volume was incomprehensible. In the last months of the war, his own soldiers had been reduced to scavenging fuel from abandoned vehicles, to marching on empty stomachs, and to fighting with dwindling ammunition reserves. And yet here, the Americans moved with an ease that bordered on decadence. The truck stopped before a chateau that had been requisitioned by Allied intelligence. The building was intact, almost serene, its stone facade unmarked by war. Inside, the Germans were led down a corridor lined with windows that looked out onto a courtyard where American soldiers played cards on overturned crates, laughing and smoking cigarettes. The sound of their laughter was startling. Decker had not heard such unguarded joy in years. War, for the Americans, seemed to be something endured between moments of leisure. They were brought into a large room that had once been a library. Shelves lined the walls, though most of the books had been removed. A long wooden table dominated the center, and behind it sat an American colonel, middle-aged, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when they entered, gesturing to chairs on the opposite side of the table. "Please sit," he said in English, then repeated it in German through an interpreter. The formality was disarming. Decker had expected to be kept standing, to be interrogated under harsh lights. Instead, The room was warm, heated by a radiator in the corner. The colonel shuffled papers, then looked up with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "I imagine you've had a difficult few days," he said. "Would you like some water?" Decker nodded, unable to stop himself. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. The colonel gestured to an aide who disappeared through a side door. The room fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. When the aide returned, Decker expected a canteen, perhaps a pitcher and tin cups. Instead, the aide carried a tray. On it were 3 glass bottles, beaded with condensation. Coca-Cola. The labels were unmistakable, red and white script against dark glass. Behind the bottles were 3 tall glasses filled with ice cubes, something Decker had not seen in months. And beside the glasses, arranged on small porcelain plates, were slices of cake. Actual cake, layered with cream and dusted with powdered sugar. For a long moment, none of the Germans moved. Hoffman stared at the tray as if it were a hallucination. Kraus blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening. Decker felt something shift inside him, a sensation he could not immediately name. Humiliation, perhaps, or disbelief. The colonel gestured toward the tray. "Please, help yourselves. We have plenty." Decker reached for one of the bottles, his hand trembling slightly. The glass was cold against his palm, shockingly cold, and when he twisted off the cap, the carbonation hissed softly. He poured the dark liquid into the glass, watching the ice cubes bob and settle. The first sip was overwhelming. Sweetness flooded his mouth, sugary and bright, a taste so foreign after months of bitter ersatz coffee and stale water that he almost choked. He set the glass down carefully, as if it might shatter. Beside him, Hoffman had taken a piece of cake, lifting the fork with mechanical precision. When he bit into it, his eyes closed briefly, and Decker saw his throat work as he swallowed. The colonel watched them with a neutral expression, then opened a folder. "We have a few questions," he said, his tone conversational. "But first, let's make sure you're comfortable. If you need more food or more drink, just let me know." To understand what those German generals felt in that moment, one must step back to the years before, to the promises that had brought them to this point. In the 1930s, as the Weimar Republic collapsed under economic despair and political chaos, the Nazi regime had offered Germany a narrative of renewal. The Versailles Treaty had humiliated the nation, stripped it of territory and pride, and reduced it to a state of prostration. Hitler's rise was not simply a matter of ideology. It was a promise of restoration, of abundance, of strength. The Third Reich marketed itself as a rejection of scarcity, a return to glory. And for a time it seemed to deliver. Autobahns stretched across the country. Factories hummed with production. The Nuremberg rallies showcased choreographed power. The massed ranks of soldiers and citizens united in purpose. But the abundance was always an illusion, a facade painted over deep structural weaknesses. Germany's economy was geared for war from the beginning, dependent on conquest to sustain itself. The Blitzkrieg victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries brought plunder, food, fuel, and raw materials that temporarily masked the Reich's inability to feed its own people or sustain prolonged conflict. By 1942, as the war dragged into the Soviet Union and North Africa, the cracks began to show. Rations were cut, synthetic substitutes replaced real food, ersatz coffee made from acorns. Bread bulked out with sawdust, meat that was more gristle than protein. The soldiers at the front, especially those on the Eastern Front, learned to scavenge, to strip the dead of anything useful, and to fight not just the enemy, but hunger and cold. The generals, insulated by rank, had fared better than their men, but they were not immune. By 1944, as the Allies closed in from both east and west, even officer messes grew sparse. The myth of German efficiency and abundance had long since dissolved into the grim reality of a nation bleeding itself dry. And yet, the propaganda persisted. The Americans and British were portrayed as decadent, soft, and dependent on their industrial might, lacking the iron will of the German soldier. The Soviet Union was depicted as an Asiatic horde, subhuman and barbaric. Germany, according to Goebbels' endless broadcasts, was the defender of European civilization, disciplined and pure. Decker had believed much of it, or wanted to. He had seen the American equipment captured in earlier battles, tanks, rifles, uniforms, and dismissed them as products of mass production, quantity over quality. The German Tiger tank was superior to the American Sherman. Everyone said so. German optics were the finest in the world. German training was the most rigorous. But as the war ground on, Decker began to notice things. The Americans did not retreat when their tanks were knocked out. They simply brought more tanks. When their supply lines were bombed, they rebuilt them overnight. They fought with a carelessness that seemed almost suicidal, throwing men and material into battle with an indifference born of inexhaustible reserves. It was not courage, he told himself. It was a waste. It was the brute force of a nation that did not understand efficiency. But now, sitting in that warm library with a bottle of Coca-Cola sweating in his hand and a slice of cake dissolving on his tongue, Decker confronted a truth he had avoided for years. This was not a waste. This was abundance. The Americans had given him, a defeated enemy general, luxuries that his own country could not provide to its soldiers in the field. They had done so without ceremony, without gloating, as if ice cream and soda were so plentiful that even prisoners merited them. And that realization struck him harder than any artillery barrage. The interrogation proceeded in a manner that further unsettled the Germans. The American colonel asked about troop movements, about supply lines, and about morale among the units. The questions were precise but not aggressive. When Decker hesitated, the colonel did not threaten or cajole. He simply waited, occasionally sipping from his own glass of Coca-Cola, as if time were a resource he had in limitless supply. Hoffman answered more freely, perhaps loosened by the sugar coursing through his system, perhaps simply exhausted by the futility of resistance. Krauss said little, but his eyes kept drifting to the tray where more cake sat untouched. After an hour, the colonel closed his folder. "That's enough for today," he said. "You'll be taken to the holding facility. Conditions there are adequate. You'll have beds, hot meals, and access to medical care." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "We're not barbarians." The comment hung in the air. Decker wanted to respond, to defend his nation, his army, but the words caught in his throat. What defense could he offer? He had seen the orders, the directives that came from Berlin. He had turned a blind eye to the SS units that operated behind his lines. He had not pulled the triggers himself, but he had known. They had all known. The holding facility was a compound of prefabricated buildings surrounded by barbed wire. Inside, the barracks were clean, heated, and furnished with cots and blankets. The Germans were given uniforms to replace their own, American fatigues with PW stenciled on the back. Decker found himself assigned to a bunk near a window. Outside, he could see American guards walking their rounds, rifles slung, their posture relaxed. One of them was eating an apple, tossing the core into the bushes when he finished. Dinner was served in a mess hall. The prisoners lined up with metal trays, and American cooks ladled out portions of stew, thick with meat and vegetables, along with bread, butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute Decker had choked down for years. There was fruit, canned but sweet. There was pie. As Decker sat at a long table with other captured officers, he listened to the murmurs of disbelief around him. A Luftwaffe major shook his head slowly, staring at his tray. "They feed us better than we fed ourselves," he muttered. Over the following days, the routine settled into something almost surreal. The prisoners were allowed to exercise in the yard, to receive Red Cross packages, and to write letters home, though they were told it might be months before those letters could be sent. Medical officers examined them, treating wounds and illnesses with a thoroughness that astonished Decker. One evening, an American dentist extracted an infected tooth from a captured Wehrmacht captain using anesthesia and clean instruments, then gave the man painkillers and antibiotics. The captain wept afterward, not from pain, but from the absurdity of it all. The symbolic power of the food became a constant undercurrent in Decker's thoughts. Every meal was a reminder of the disparity between the two nations. The Americans did not simply have more, they had so much that they could afford to be generous to their enemies. And it was not just food. The camp had a makeshift library stocked with books and magazines. There was a recreation area with a volleyball net. One Sunday, the prisoners were shown a film, a Hollywood musical, absurdly cheerful and full of dancing and singing. Decker watched in silence, his mind struggling to reconcile the world on the screen with the world he had inhabited for the past 6 years. He thought about his men, the soldiers he had commanded. They had fought with discipline and courage, even as their supply lines collapsed, even as the promises of victory turned to ash. They had believed, as he had believed, that their sacrifices mattered, that they were part of something greater. But here, in this prisoner of war camp, surrounded by abundance he could not have imagined, Decker began to question the foundation of that belief. If Germany represented strength and efficiency, why had it starved? If America was decadent and weak, why was it drowning in plenty? The historical record supports what Decker and countless other German prisoners experienced. The United States entered World War II as the world's largest economy, and its industrial capacity was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, and 6,500 naval vessels. The scale was so immense that even the Allies struggled to absorb it. Weapons and vehicles piled up at ports, waiting to be shipped overseas. Food production followed a similar trajectory. American farms, mechanized and efficient, churned out grain, meat and dairy in quantities that fed not only the U.S. military, but much of the Allied war effort. Soldiers in the field received 3 hot meals a day whenever possible, along with supplemental rations that included chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum. The treatment of prisoners of war was codified in the Geneva Convention, but the United States went beyond the minimum requirements. German POWs held in camps across the United States and Europe were given diets that exceeded the caloric intake of civilians in many Allied nations. They received medical care, recreational facilities, and, in many cases, opportunities to work for pay. The rationale was partly humanitarian and partly pragmatic. Well-treated prisoners were more cooperative, less likely to attempt escape, and more willing to provide intelligence. But there was also an ideological component. The United States wanted to demonstrate the superiority of its system, to show that democracy and capitalism could provide abundance even in wartime. For the Germans, the contrast was stark. By 1945, the average German civilian was subsisting on a diet of around 1,500 calories per day, well below the level needed for sustained health. Soldiers at the front often fared worse, especially on the Eastern Front, where supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The Wehrmacht's logistics were chaotic, reliant on horse-drawn carts and requisitioned vehicles. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Ammunition was rationed. Food supplies were so inadequate that soldiers joked bitterly about Goebbels' ham, a tin of thin soup. In the prisoner of war camp, Decker began to speak with other captured officers, men from different branches and backgrounds, and he found that his experience was not unique. A U-boat commander described being fished from the Atlantic after his submarine was sunk, expecting to be left to drown or shot in the water. Instead, the American destroyer that rescued him gave him dry clothes, hot soup, and a bunk. A panzer lieutenant from the Africa Corps recounted being captured in Tunisia and transported to a camp in the American South, where he was served fried chicken and peach pie, foods he had never tasted before. The abundance was not an accident, it was policy, a deliberate projection of American power. One evening, as Decker sat in the barracks writing a letter to his wife, a letter he knew might never reach her, he overheard a conversation between two younger officers. One of them, a captain in his late 20s, was describing his first meal as a prisoner. "They gave us ice cream," he said, his voice tinged with something like awe. "Not just a little. A whole bowl. Vanilla. I hadn't seen ice cream since before the war." The other officer laughed. A bitter sound. "They're rubbing our noses in it," he said, "showing us how badly we lost." Decker considered that interpretation. Was it cruelty? A calculated humiliation? But he did not think so. The Americans had not gloated. They had not lectured. They had simply provided it with a casualness that suggested they saw it as normal, as baseline. And that, Decker realized, was the point. For the Americans, abundance was not a luxury. It was the default state. They had built a society so productive, so efficient, that even in the midst of total war, they could afford to be generous. The ice cream was not a taunt, it was a statement of fact. The symbolic resonance of food in this context cannot be overstated. Food in wartime is more than sustenance. It is a measure of capability, of organization, of national strength. The German military had prided itself on discipline, on the ability to endure hardship, but endurance is a virtue born of necessity. The Americans did not need to endure. They could indulge. And in that indulgence lay a deeper truth, that the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, had created a level of prosperity that the Third Reich, with all its grandiose ambitions, could never match. As weeks turned into months, Decker began to see the camp not as a prison, but as a microcosm of the world the Americans were building. Prisoners were organized into work details, repairing roads and clearing rubble, and they were paid in scrip that could be used at a camp store, stocked with cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. There were classes in English, taught by American soldiers who volunteered their time. There were newspapers, censored but informative, that described the progress of the war and the collapse of the Reich. Decker read about the fall of Berlin, about Hitler's suicide, and about the unconditional surrender. He felt numb and hollowed out, as if the core of his identity had been excised. One afternoon, a group of prisoners was shown a film, but this time it was not a musical. It was a documentary, footage shot by Allied troops as they liberated concentration camps. Decker sat in the darkened room, watching skeletal figures stagger toward the camera, watching bulldozers push mountains of corpses into mass graves. The room was silent except for the projector's whir. When the lights came on, no one moved. Decker stared at his hands, unable to look up. He had known, in an abstract way, that such places existed. He had not allowed himself to think about it, to confront the implications. Now, confronted with the evidence, he could not hide. An American officer stood at the front of the room. "This is what you fought for," he said, his voice flat. "This is what your leaders built. You can deny it, you can claim ignorance, but you cannot change the fact that it happened." Decker wanted to protest, to say that he had been a soldier, not a butcher, but the words died in his throat. The line between soldier and accomplice had always been thinner than he wanted to admit. That night, lying on his bunk, Decker thought about the cake and the Coca-Cola, the ice cream and the coffee. He thought about the abundance that the Americans wielded like a weapon, not through violence, but through generosity. And he realized that this, too, was a kind of warfare. The Germans had tried to conquer through force, through terror, and through the imposition of will. The Americans conquered through seduction, through the promise of a better life, and through the simple, undeniable fact that their system worked. You could hate them, you could resent them, but you could not ignore the evidence. They had won not just the war, but the argument. In the epilogue of his captivity, Decker was transferred to a larger camp in France, then eventually to a camp in the United States itself, where he spent the next 2 years before repatriation. The camps in America were surreal. Prisoners worked on farms, harvesting crops alongside civilians. They attended church services, played soccer, and formed orchestras. Some fell in love with the country, choosing to stay after the war ended. Decker did not. He returned to Germany in 1947 to a land devastated and divided, to a wife who barely recognized him and children who had grown up in his absence. But he carried with him the memory of that first meal, of the cold glass bottle and the sweet fizz of Coca-Cola, of the cake that had tasted like an indictment. He carried the knowledge that the war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in the foundries and factories, in the bread baskets and dairy farms, and in the vast churning engine of American production. The Third Reich had promised its people 1,000 years. It had delivered 12 years of glory and ruin. The Americans, with their casual abundance, had demonstrated something far more enduring, that a society built on freedom and prosperity could outproduce, outlast, and ultimately outlive any empire built on conquest and cruelty. In the years that followed, Decker rarely spoke of the war. When he did, when pressed by journalists or historians, he often returned to that moment in the library, to the tray of soda and cake. "They didn't need to do that," he would say. "They could have given us water, and we would have been grateful. But they gave us more. Not because they were trying to humiliate us, but because they could. Because for them, it was nothing. And that told me everything I needed to know about who had really won." The symbolic power of that generosity lingered long after the war ended. German prisoners returned home with stories of American plenty, stories that seeped into the collective consciousness and shaped the rebuilding of post-war Germany. The Marshall Plan, which pumped billions of dollars into European recovery, was a continuation of the same principle, that abundance could be a tool of influence, that prosperity could forge alliances more durable than any treaty. The Cold War that followed was, in many ways, a contest between two visions of abundance, the American promise of consumer plenty versus the Soviet promise of collective sufficiency. And in that contest, the memory of Coca-Cola and cake became a metaphor for the power of the American model. For Decker, the lesson was personal and painful. He had spent his adult life in service to a regime that promised greatness and delivered ash. He had believed in the superiority of German discipline, German efficiency, and German will. And he had been defeated, not by superior soldiers, but by superior logistics. Not by better tactics, but by better farms. Not by ideology, but by the simple, overwhelming fact that the United States could afford to give its enemies cake while its own soldiers drank Coca-Cola in the ruins of conquered cities. In the end, the war had been won and lost in the fields of Iowa, in the factories of Detroit, and in the stockyards of Chicago. It had been won by a nation that could fight a global war on multiple fronts, while its citizens at home enjoyed a standard of living that most of the world could not imagine. It had been lost by a regime that bled its people dry in pursuit of an empire that could never sustain itself. And so, when General Major Carl Decker thought back to that cold January morning in 1945, when he had asked for water and been given Coca-Cola, he understood that he had not just surrendered his command. He had surrendered to an idea, to a vision of the world where abundance was not a reward for conquest, but a product of freedom, where strength was measured not in the ability to endure suffering, but in the capacity to create wealth. It was a bitter lesson, one that cost him his pride and his certainty. But it was, in its own way, a kind of liberation. because in the ruins of the Third Reich, as he sipped soda and ate cake, Decker glimpsed a future that his old world could never have built, a future where wars might still be fought, but where the victors offered not just terms of surrender, but slices of hope, sweetened and cold.